Subscribe to the channel and watch until the end, because this story has been softened over time. The life of a slave in Babylon, the brutal punishment applied to rebels. In Babylon of the 6th century before Christ, an adult and healthy man was worth between 20 and 30 shekels of silver. That was the official price, recorded in contract, stamped by scribes. An ox cost more, a war horse much more, but that man was not being compared to animals by chance. In the eyes of Babylonian law, he was not a person, he was merchandise, and merchandise has no will, has no name, has no right to say no. Babylon did not invent slavery, but it transformed this practice into a system so organized, so documented, so ingrained in the structure of the city that it functioned like the blood inside a body. Without it, nothing moved. The temples did not receive offerings. The palaces had no servants. The fields did not produce barley. The canals did not carry water. The greatest city of the ancient world, with its walls of 80 kilometers in length and its towers that seemed to touch the sky, depended entirely on people who had not chosen to be there. Think of the scale of this. 80 kilometers of walls, the equivalent of walking from one end to the other of a modern city twice. Every meter of that wall needed to be planned, excavated, molded, raised, and coated. Every brick was made by hand. Every stone was carried on human shoulders. The engineering was impressive, the human cost incalculable. It is estimated that between 15 and 20% of the Babylonian population was composed of slaves. In absolute numbers, this meant something between 40,000 and 60,000 people in the capital alone during the height of the empire. People who woke up every day knowing that their body belonged to another, that their time was not theirs, that their entire life fit into a line of a commercial contract. The city of Babylon, at its height, had approximately 200,000 people. It was the largest metropolis on the planet, larger than any Greek city, larger than any Egyptian settlement. Its streets were wide enough for 2 war chariots to pass side by side. Its temples reached heights that no other civilization could equal. And behind all this greatness, there existed an invisible army of forced laborers who would never receive credit for anything. They came from different places. Some were prisoners of war, captured in the military campaigns that expanded the empire as far as Egypt. The conquests of Nebuchadnezzar II brought tens of thousands of captives. The campaign against Jerusalem alone in 586 before Christ resulted in the deportation of approximately 10,000 people. Artisans, soldiers, priests, entire families torn from their lands and transported to serve in a foreign empire. Others were born already in the condition of slaves, children of mothers who also never knew freedom. The law was clear. The child of a female slave belonged to the mother's owner. It did not matter who the father was. No circumstance mattered. The condition was transmitted through the womb, like a cursed inheritance that no one asked to receive. There were those who fell due to debts, unable to pay what they owed to implacable creditors. In Babylon, unforgiven debt transformed the debtor into property. A merchant who failed could wake up as a slave the next day. A peasant who lost the harvest could hand over his own family to settle what he owed. The line between freedom and slavery was thin, and thousands crossed it every year, and there existed still those condemned by justice, transformed into property as a form of punishment for crimes they sometimes had not even committed. The Babylonian judicial system did not know prison in the modern sense. Punishment was physical, financial, or servile. Who could not pay a fine, paid with the body, paid with years, paid with the entire life. The process of transformation was brutal in its simplicity. A free man entered a tribunal or a battlefield. He left there with a mark, sometimes literal, burned into the skin with hot iron, sometimes only documentary, recorded on clay tablets that would be archived for generations. His old name disappeared. In its place, a record emerged, the owner's name, the assigned function, the estimated value. From that moment on, he ceased to exist as an individual. He came to be a tool. Life began before the sun rose. There was no alarm clock. There was no kindness. There was fear. Domestic slaves slept in corners of their masters' houses, always available, always alert. A call in the middle of the night demanded an immediate response. A delay could mean punishment. Sleep was interrupted, rest incomplete. The body never relaxed completely. Rural slaves lived in collective barracks near the fields, piled up in spaces that offered only the minimum to keep a body functioning. Mud walls, straw roofs, beaten earth floors. 20-30 people sharing a space that would barely fit a family. The smell of sweat and exhaustion impregnated everything. Privacy did not exist, dignity even less. Those who worked in the temples had slightly better lodgings, but the surveillance was even more constant. The god needed to be served without failures. Marduk, the principal Babylonian deity, received daily offerings that required an army of servers. Preparing sacred foods, cleaning sanctuaries, keeping lamps lit, carrying statues in processions. Everything timed, everything supervised, everything recorded. The work varied, but the exhaustion was the same. Agricultural slaves spent up to 14 hours a day in the fields of barley and wheat that fed the city. Mesopotamia was fertile, but demanding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers needed to be tamed through a complex system of canals, dikes, and reservoirs. Digging these canals under a sun that easily exceeded 40 degrees was work for bodies that had no choice. They carried baskets of grain that weighed more than 30 kilos each, the equivalent of carrying a calf on the shoulders, going up and down hundreds of times a day. Their bodies aged at double speed. A rural slave rarely passed 40 years of age. The majority did not reach 35, died of exhaustion, of disease, of accidents that no one bothered to avoid. Urban slaves faced another type of wear. In pottery workshops, they breathed dust all day long. Dry clay, sand, particles that accumulated in the lungs until there was no more space for air. In metal foundries, they worked near furnaces that reached temperatures capable of melting bronze more than 1,000 degrees. Burns were common, scars universal. Some lost fingers, hands, entire arms in accidents that were part of the routine. In public works, they raised mud bricks that weighed between 8 and 12 kilos each, climbing improvised ramps to build walls that sometimes exceeded 20 meters in height. Imagine climbing an inclined ramp carrying weight equivalent to 2 large watermelons, repeating this movement 200-300 times a day. Without safety equipment, without a protection net, without anyone to succor whoever fell. The Ishtar Gate, covered in blue tiles that until today impress whoever visits the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, was raised by hands that never received credit. Each of those enameled bricks needed to be molded, decorated, fired, and positioned with millimetric precision. Lions, bulls, and dragons parade along the walls in a procession that celebrates Babylonian power. None of them celebrates who actually built that work. Domestic slaves lived a silent contradiction. They dwelt inside the richest houses of the city. They saw up close the luxury they would never touch. They served banquets with meats, fruits, imported wines, and desserts they would never taste. Their task seemed lighter when compared to work in the fields or on construction sites, cleaning, cooking, caring for children, accompanying ladies to the market, preparing baths, organizing clothes. But proximity to the owners brought another type of prison. There was no moment of true rest. There was no space where the master's gaze did not reach. Surveillance was constant, error unforgivable. A broken dish could result in whippings. A cross answer could cost the sale to a worse owner. A misinterpreted look could destroy years of careful survival. Feeding followed a cold calculation. The slave received enough not to die. No more than that. The base was barley bread, the cheapest grain available, and water. Sometimes a portion of dried dates or raw onions. Meat was a luxury reserved for specific dates, when the master decided to be generous or when something was left over from banquets. The daily ration hovered around 1,500 calories. Enough to survive, insufficient to live. Hunger never disappeared completely. It stayed there as a permanent companion, reminding the body of its condition. Thefts of food were punished with severity. Hiding food was a crime. Sharing one's Own ration with another weaker slave was risking punishment for both. The system transformed hunger into a tool of control. Whoever is worried about the next meal has no energy to plan revolts. Sickness was no reason to stop. A feverish slave continued working until falling, literally falling, fainting in the field, collapsing in the workshop, crumbling in the middle of a task. Only then might someone pay attention, and even so, the concern was not with the person. It was with the lost productivity. If the sickness was too long, the slave became a loss. And loss had a certain destination: sale, abandonment, or simply oblivion. Commercial records of the time show transactions of 6 slaves sold for minimal prices, sometimes less than 5 shekels of silver, less than a fifth of the value of a healthy slave. The equivalent of getting rid of a broken tool before it took up space in the warehouse. Old age did not guarantee rest. There was no retirement. There was no gratitude for years of service. The slave worked as long as his body endured. When it endured no more, he was discarded. Some were lucky and were kept by more pious masters, perhaps designated for lighter tasks. The majority did not have this luck, simply vanished from the records, ceased to exist. But brutal work was not the worst aspect of Babylonian slavery. The worst was the punishment. The Code of Hammurabi, engraved on a stele of black stone with more than 280 laws, dedicated dozens of articles to the question of slaves, not to protect them, to control them. Babylonian law was precise, detailed, and implacable. Each infraction had its consequence mapped. Each attempt at resistance had its price defined. There was no margin for interpretation. There was no space for mercy. Flight was the supreme crime, not because it represented a great economic loss for the owner. A runaway slave could be replaced by another, bought at the next market. The problem was symbolic. A slave who fled showed the others that the system had flaws, that it was possible to say no, that obedience was not the only option available. This idea was more dangerous than any financial loss. Therefore, the response was disproportionate. It had to be. When a slave disappeared, the entire city went on alert. Gates were watched with redoubled attention. Guards interrogated travelers. Merchants were obliged to report any suspicious person. Peasants working in the outskirts received orders to denounce strangers. Article 16 of the Code of Hammurabi determined that whoever hid a fugitive slave would be condemned to death. Without prolonged trial, without possible appeal, the entire society transformed into an instrument of surveillance. Capturing a fugitive yielded a reward, 2 shekels of silver for whoever brought the slave back to the legitimate owner. It seems little, but it was the equivalent of 2 weeks of work of a free artisan, sufficient to motivate improvised hunters. Peasants, merchants, travelers, even other slaves denounced escapes in exchange for those coins. Distrust spread like a disease. No one could trust anyone. Any person could be an informer. When the fugitive was captured, the punishment did not happen in secret. It was public, deliberately public. Other slaves were gathered to watch, forced to look, forbidden to avert their eyes. The objective was not only to cause pain in the rebel's body, it was to cause fear in the minds of all the others. Each blow of the whip, each stifled scream, each mark left on the skin functioned as a message encoded in blood. Do not try. Do not think of trying. Do not dream of trying. The methods varied according to the gravity of the flight. A first attempt could result in whippings. 50, 100 blows distributed on the back until the skin opened. The slave would survive, but would carry the scars as a permanent warning. A second attempt brought more severe consequences. Mutilations enter the records. Marks with hot iron on the face, so that everyone would know immediately the history of that person. Article 282 of the Code of Hammurabi authorized the cutting of the ear of the slave who denied his owner. A permanent mutilation, a visible mark that would accompany that person for the rest of life. Anyone who saw it would know immediately. This one tried to resist. This one was punished. This one serves as a living example of what happens to whoever defies the established order. Collective rebellions provoked even more extreme reactions. Small groups that tried to organize stoppages, sabotage productions, or plan mass escapes were treated as a threat to the state itself. They were not seen as dissatisfied workers. They were seen as internal enemies. The response was military. Soldiers were mobilized, leaders identified through interrogations that knew no limits. Executions were not rare, and even whoever survived faced a destiny calculated to destroy any possibility of new organization. The rebels were dispersed, sold to distant regions of the empire, separated from any person with whom they had formed bonds. A slave who worked in the wheat fields to the north could wake up being transported to the salt mines to the south, hundreds of kilometers from everything he knew, without warning, without farewell, without chance to maintain contact. The punishment did not end with physical chastisement. It ended with absolute isolation, with the destruction of any network that could generate new resistance. Fear was architecture. Each law, each punishment, each public example built an invisible structure more solid than any wall of bricks. Slaves did not need chains all the time. Fear did that work for free. They knew what happened to whoever tried. They saw the marked bodies circulating among them. They heard the accounts whispered in moonless nights. Obedience was not a moral choice. It was a survival strategy. It was the calculation of one who wants to see the next day. Even within legality, the slave had no real defense. His testimony had no weight against that of a free man. If a master decided that his slave had committed a fault, he did not need to prove anything. His word sufficed. If he decided to sell, separating families that had formed in captivity, he did not need justification. If he decided to punish by caprice, without apparent reason, the slave had no one to turn to. And yet, resistance never disappeared completely. It was not resistance of great revolts with flags and charismatic leaders. It was resistance of small, invisible gestures, tools, broken on purpose, work done slower than possible, food hidden to share with others, information about escape routes passed from mouth to mouth, songs that seemed innocent but carried ciphered messages, small sabotages that rarely appear in official records, but that explain why laws needed to be repeated, reinforced, hardened over the centuries. Babylonian scribes left thousands of clay tablets with administrative records. Among them appear complaints from owners about slaves who did not produce the expected, reports of escapes that were never solved, mentions of punishments applied repeatedly to the same individuals, as if one were not enough, as if two were not sufficient. The system was efficient, but it was not perfect, and each failure, however small, proved that the human spirit does not bend as easily as the law imagines. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, between 605 and 562 before Christ, the system reached its apex. Constant wars brought immense flows of prisoners. The conquest of Jerusalem resulted in the deportation of thousands of Jews to Babylon, including the intellectual and religious elite of the people. The prophet Ezekiel was among them. The prophet Daniel, too. They joined the Egyptians. Captured in campaigns to the south, the Syrians brought from wars to the north. The Phoenicians dragged from the Mediterranean coast, and tens of other peoples who fed the slave machine of the empire. Babylon was a cauldron of languages, cultures, and shared sufferings. People who would never have met in other circumstances now shared the same condition, the same hunger, the same fear. The city grew without stopping. Works multiplied. The famous hanging gardens, if they really existed as described by Greek historians, would have required the work of thousands of slaves for years on end. Stepped terraces more than 20 meters high. Irrigation systems that pumped water from the Euphrates to the top. Trees and flowers from distant regions planted in earth, carried on the shoulders of nameless people. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar, with its decorated halls and its endless courtyards, was raised by hands that would never step into those environments as guests. Enameled bricks, reliefs of hunting lions, inscriptions glorifying the king's conquests. Each detail required skill, time, and forced labor. The beauty that we admire in museums until today carries a history that we would prefer to forget. The prophet Daniel, according to the biblical account preserved in the book that bears his name, lived in this Babylon. Not as a common slave, it is true. His intelligence elevated him to the position of counselor in the court. But he saw the functioning of the system up close. He knew the corridors of power. He observed how the administrative machine treated those who were at the bottom. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, interpreted by Daniel in chapter 2 of his book, speaks of a statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay mixed with iron. Empires, that seem solid, invincible, eternal, but that carry invisible fragilities in the very base. Perhaps no fragility was greater than the absolute dependence on the forced labor of people who never chose to be there. The Babylonian slave system was legal, documented, normalized. It was not seen as a necessary evil that needed to be justified. It was seen as the natural order of things. The gods themselves, according to Mesopotamian religion, had created humans to serve. Humanity existed to work in the place of the deities. Slavery was merely a logical extension of this theology. Some were born to command. Others were born to obey. To question this was to question the cosmos itself. This normalization is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole system. They were not monsters applying tortures for sadistic pleasure. They were administrators following procedures written in manuals, scribes recording commercial transactions as if they were any other, judges applying the law with the same coldness they would apply to disputes over land or inheritances, common people participating in a system that transformed other people into things. Banality was an essential part of the horror. The slaves did not leave their own stories. The majority did not know how to write. Those who knew did not have access to the clay tablets reserved for important matters. Everything we know about them comes from the records of their owners. Contracts of purchase and sale, inventories of properties listing slaves alongside furniture and animals, lists of applied punishments, complaints about low productivity. They are silenced voices that we only know by the echo left in the documents of those who silenced them. It is like trying to reconstruct the life of a person looking only at the invoices they failed to pay. Fragments, distortions, absences that scream louder than any preserved word. But this silence does not mean absence. Each record of flight is proof that someone tried. Each repeated law is evidence that the previous one was not enough to contain everyone. Each exemplary punishment confirms that there was something to be exemplarily punished. Resistance is there between the lines, in the empty spaces, waiting to be recognized by whoever knows how to look. Babylon fell in 539 before Christ, conquered by the Persians of Cyrus the Great. The walls that seemed eternal were crossed in a single night, according to accounts. The palaces that impressed the world became the property of new owners, and the slaves who sustained all that simply passed from one master to another. Liberation did not come with the fall of the empire. The change of flag did not change the condition of whoever was at the bottom. Liberation came for some decades later, when Cyrus allowed deported peoples to return to their lands of origin. The exiled Jews were able to return to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. They restarted their lives in a land that many only knew through the stories of the elders. Ezra and Nehemiah recorded this return. The Psalms sang the end of captivity. But thousands of other slaves remained where they were, without a decree to liberate them, without a prophet to announce their return, without a history to remember them by name. They continued working in the same fields, in the same workshops, in the same palaces. Only the owners changed. The condition remained. Their names were never recorded in any sacred book. Their faces were never carved on any stele. Their voices were never heard by anyone who could transmit them. Babylon fell. Its walls turned to dust. Its palaces were swallowed by the desert. Nebuchadnezzar, who thought himself eternal, became a name in a history book. But one thing crossed the centuries without needing bricks or armies: the idea that no system, however powerful it may be, manages to erase completely the human desire for freedom. The Babylonian slaves did not leave monuments. They did not sign treaties. But each attempt at flight, each silent sabotage, each invisible refusal, proved something that the Code of Hammurabi never managed to foresee. Fear controls the body, never the soul. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson that the dust of Babylon still manages to teach.